my heart.
Oh, that's where all the good stuff is. The thick crust right at the bottom.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
I'm the douche. No, I am a douche. I'm Kyle. Hey, what's up? I don't fucking know. I've had a lot of coffee.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliarmedia. And if you would like to help us out with hosting costs, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia, where anything you would be able to contribute would be very much appreciated by all of us. Today, we are talking about Star Trek as a campaign setting. A topic that is near a topic that is very near and dear to all of our hearts. is definitely my first geek love.
Mm-hmm. I'm really excited, if you can't tell.
I don't know if it's my first, but it's definitely among the first two.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember which one I saw first, Wars or Trek.
I don't know if I can call it my first, but I can absolutely call it my most foundational, most influential to my life.
Yeah, my personal opinion is there's a whole lot more in Star Trek that you can model your life after than Star Wars.
Yeah. I mean, this is not a Star Wars versus Star Trek podcast, nor is this episode going to be that. I love them. I love them both. Yet, but to model oneself after the ethics of the Federation versus the ethics of the Jedi Order. A lot more there.
I've been doing handstands for years now, and I'm really making progress on floating rocks with my brain. I'm telling you, there's something there.
I'm not getting any muscle mass, but I'm really good at clinging when you let me kind of backpack you as you do these flips. Thank you, by the way, for that.
Yeah, lots of vines to swing on in Southeast Ohio.
I've loved Star Trek since I first caught the original, or not the original series. Yes, it probably was the original series. Yeah, I was young enough. This was before TNG. I very vaguely remember watching Star Trek over at my grandmother's house, or no, not my grandmother's house, my great-grandmother's house, whenever I was really little. And I'm pretty sure that one of the episodes that I watched was the iconic fight between Kirk and Spock when Spock is going through the pond bar.
I grew up watching weird old sci-fi with my dad, like Forbidden Planet, all the, like, Ray Harryhausen, like, stop-motion monster shit, and, old episodes of, like, Twilight Zone and Outer Limits as well. And so I did watch, even though TNG was out and airing when I was a little kid, I would say I grew up on the original series. But then once junior high hit, I matured with and into Next Gen.
I started on Next Generation. I remember watching, like, the movies, the original series movies, while I was also learning about Next Generation. But it wasn't until a couple years later, like in the mid-90s, when I started watching, like, reruns of the original series. I don't think it was until Netflix came out that I sat down and did, like, the whole run of all of it, animated series included.
Same here. Yep. There were some gems in the animated series.
Yeah. There was also some stinkers. Giant Spock.
Yeah. Giant Spock that's just as cool as regular Spock. He's just twice as tall.
Despite having seen a lot of Trek, I've never gone through and finished all of Next Gen in one start to finish, and I'm in season 3 of doing that, and I'm going to jump into Deep Space Nine and watch in tandem, and then go to that, and then I'm going to go into Voyager. It's going to be an undertaking, but whether you, dear listener, have done what we have done / I am doing, or if you're just tangentially familiar with it, if you're thinking of or have any desire to run or play in a Star Trek game, hit me up, just slide into my DMs. But more importantly, listen to this episode, because that's kind of the point, right? We're going to kind of talk about how to run a game in this large, decades-spanning setting.
Mm-hmm. More than 50 years at this point.
Yeah.
So what would you say are some of the more essential things that a person familiarize themselves with Star Trek in order to really understand the setting? Like, how would you introduce somebody to Star Trek who really wasn't that familiar with it? Would you start with having them watch selected episodes of different series? Would you have them start watching movies? Where would you guys start?
For a modern audience, meaning like younger people, I would probably start with Next Generation instead of the original series, because I think that unless you've got a childhood attachment to it, it's real campy. It's got a lot of cheese in there, man. I mean, there's some great episodes, don't get me wrong, but, you know...
First couple of seasons are really rough.
It's easy to get real distracted by just how awful the effects are and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Even with the, you know, the special edition, whatever stuff that they've done with the ships and everything. I think Next Gen is just a better put together show that has a lot of the same like modern writing and storytelling, character building elements that you'd expect out of like high quality modern television.
That said, I would not recommend someone brand new to Trek start with, honestly, anything in season 1 or 2 of Next Gen. There are some gems, I think, in both of those seasons. I truly believe that. But if you show somebody even one of the good ones of season 2 and they're like, okay, hell yeah, let's keep going with this, you're going to encounter some real duds.
I agree. Encounter at Farpoint is just not a good...
Yeah, that's the pilot.
Episodes.
That's the fucking pilot.
There's 2 hours.
Yeah, and they're still doing original series at that point.
Mm-hmm, pretty much.
The same exact kind of setup.
I mean, it's shit. Episode 3 or 4, when they literally do a rehash of that TOS plot where the whole crew has like a space virus that makes them drunk and act on their like animal impulses, essentially.
And Data gets laid.
And Data fucking bones down, man. Fully functional and trained in lots of different methods. And again, if you're as big of a fan as we are, or you're growing into a fan or whatever, there's some fucking gems in those first 2 seasons of Next Gen, and like, it's worth it. Watch them, you know, like, settle in, boys. It's gonna get bumpy. But don't start there. Don't fucking start there. I was actually gonna say, I might start somebody off if they have an appreciation of, air quoting, classic or like older movies. Like if somebody, you know, grew up watching black and white movies or enjoys like kind of older cinema and it's like differing philosophies and pacing, start them off with Wrath of Khan, Star Trek 2. It's a good movie. It has older style acting, older themes. The effects, I think, still pretty much hold up. The models are really good. There's some true horror. There's some awesome fights. I might start somebody there.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to start there from a blank slate, though, because that is built on the original series episode where Khan's introduced.
True. I haven't watched that episode in a while, so I don't know if it holds up as an episode for someone to start with. But I think you could sit somebody down and say, all right, in the future, things get shitty. There are genetically engineered super soldiers that fight in wars. It ends in nearly complete nuclear annihilation. But we manage to save ourselves. Aliens show up. The Vulcans. We have a, like, you know, blossoming federation of cultures. We're exploring space. Go. Hit play.
My point is that it's a revenge movie.
Uh-huh.
And unless you know why Khan is trying to get revenge on Kirk, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Maybe.
What about the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies? Would you, for somebody who is not familiar with Star Trek, who is younger, who is 25 or less, would you start with that, saying this is an idea of what Star Trek can be?
If they don't already like, I'm air quoting here again, older cinema, yes. Like, I have some friends who cannot watch any movie made before, like, 1990 because, whatever, they get pulled out of it. They're like, this is garbage. It's so different, I can't get into it. And for someone who is more familiar with modern cinematic principles, I actually think the 2009 first in the JJ verse Star Trek movies was fine. It's fine.
I'm going to be the asshole gatekeeper here. If that is the kind of mindset a person has, they're not going to be into the bulk of what Trek is anyway. If what you're into is like some kind of like Michael Bay sort of cinema, or J.J. Abrams, whatever you want to throw out there, you're not going to have the patience, you're not going to have, frankly, the intellectual maturity to sit down and appreciate Star Trek, what it's trying to convey, the complexity of the topics. It's just not your kind of sci-fi.
At the gate to Star Trek, we have Jordan posted up with a weapon of choice, longsword? Phaser? Okay, I have a halberd. It's useless against the phaser, but we don't fight each other. Instead, we welcome you. And whereas Jordan tries to persuade you to stay away from going through this gate, which we are keeping, I will encourage you. Please, no, come in. Do come in. Don't listen to him. Don't listen to my compadre here. Star Trek is a wonderful, wonderful experience, full of diversity and the founding principles of modern cinematic approach, especially in terms of diversity and representation. Star Trek fucking authored that shit. So check it out. Don't be afraid.
I personally would avoid the movies as a point to start somebody out, regardless of whether it's the good movies or the J.J. Abrams movies. I would say I would start with curated episodes of, well, whichever series would be most in tune with what campaign I was going to be running. Because there are certain episodes that really encapsulate what Star Trek is, the ideas behind it, and give a very good primer on what you need to understand about the world itself. I've got a few episodes written down here from each series, or for most of the series, to kind of give a baseline of where I would point people to go, to the point of whether a modern day person would be able to go back and watch something that is older than that. I feel like there are some episodes that really do stand up as long as you go into the mindset of this isn't cinema, this is television. Mm-hmm. Even though nowadays television tries to be like cinema, mm-hmm. Back in the day, television was its own thing, cinema was its own thing, and they really told different types of stories. Mm-hmm. For the original series, I would say the two most important episodes to watch would be The Balance of Terror, which is the episode which is essentially a submarine movie where the Enterprise is hunting down this Romulan vessel that they believe is cloaked. It is the first appearance in the series of Romulans, or in Star Trek of Romulans. Mm-hmm. The story is told from the perspective of both sides of this cat and mouse game. And both sides, you hear subordinate officers trying to dehumanize their opponents. And you have a voice of a leader in charge basically pointing out that we are just as much monsters to them, mm-hmm. as they are to us. Another episode from the original series, the second one I would point to, would be The City on the Edge of Tomorrow, where... On
the Edge of Forever, you mean?
It's the Guardian on the Edge of Forever is the thing.
City on the Edge of Tomorrow.
But the episode is The City on the Edge of Tomorrow.
You got me.
In this episode, it is discovered that there is a time portal on a planet. Somebody needs to go back into the past in order to fix something that has gone wrong, because McCoy has come down with some sort of space virus and has lost his mind temporarily, and he goes back in time and completely screws over history. So Kirk and Spock have to go back in time and try to stop him, but they don't get there at the right time. They end up getting there a little early. So it's this little vignette of them arriving in 1930s Great Depression era New York, I want to say. And it's really a slice of life story about like how they're trying to improve the world. And it comes down to Kirk having to make a choice because he realizes the woman that he falls in love with, if she lives, this is why the future gets screwed up. Mm-hmm. And so he ends up having to sacrifice her in order to allow for this bright future that lays ahead for all of us. That's what allows it to happen, because by some weird confluence of events, her continuing to live means that the U.S. doesn't enter into World War II when it does.
That might seem like a strange one. You're thinking, what the fuck, 1940s or late 1930s New York, time travel. Why is this important to Star Trek? But one, they love time travel, and time travel's fun to fuck around with. It's been in Star Trek for 50 years and will forever be in Star Trek. It's a fun theme. And two, it is a great way of illustrating the codes of ethics, the codes of honor. Not to be confused with the Next Gen episode Code of Honor, though. But it shows the mentality of not just Starfleet, but of Star Trek, I think, as a property. This idea that hard decisions sometimes need to be made. This idea that, like, even though dark things are happening, there's still hope for a brighter future.
That's the thing. It's a contrast between a setting that people understand from our past versus the ideal future that Star Trek is supposed to represent.
And while we're on that topic, I guess, I don't think it's impossible to run a Star Trek game that gets dark and heavy, and perhaps even, due to players' actions, has a bad ending. But most games of Trek you're going to run and you're going to play in my opinion, should follow that bright future ideal that Gene Roddenberry started in 1966. I say most. I say 69% of games you should run and play in. Bright future.
I wouldn't go that far. I would say it depends on what kind of story someone wants to run. And I'm going to call you out here. You haven't watched Deep Space Nine. That is some of the best trial of an ideology in fire that I've ever seen. Because, yeah, they're going into it with that kind of, progressive future ideal, this ultimate humanism, whatever. But then when faced with overwhelming force of an aggressive opponent, there's interesting compromises, and there's, a lot of cool story that happens in there. And I think it's, have some stuff like that. Have your, romp to a planet and see what's going on there and deal with that little thing or whatever. But there's also a lot of cool stuff that can happen when you really test this stuff.
To me, the core of Star Trek is you have an ideal, but all of the people who are striving for that ideal are flawed humans.
Absolutely.
They have their quirks, they have their prejudices, and they are able to recognize that they have these, and they are working toward correcting that issue in themselves. Every Star Trek main hero goes through that at some point, often multiple times.
Yeah.
Even Jean-Luc Picard, who is probably one of the greatest role models for a human being that you can have, has points where he is suffering from post-traumatic stress. He is racist against a particular species, and he allows that prejudice to nearly cause the destruction of everybody who was around him.
Yeah. Early in Picard's career, he was in a bar drinking with some Starfleet officers, and some Nausicaans walk in, and just because they were Nausicaans, he decided to go and spout off a few choice words and got fucking stabbed through the heart because he was being a racist hick in a hillbilly bar, essentially. Mind you, he grows, he learns. Another, I think, core principle of a Star Trek game, be it a dark or lighter in mood campaign, there's plenty of room for either of those things.
And it should I think both should be in the same campaign. You should have the dark as well as the light.
Certainly. But there is usually some kind of character growth, characters learning lessons. This is not like once a Jedi, always a Jedi. This is personal growth and journeys through and sometimes bending those guiding principles of Star Trek, these codes of ethics and codes of honor.
To me, like, the kind of underlying ethos of it is sort of like the ascendance of like scientific thought, not just in the way that you figure out facts about the world, but in the way that you think about yourself and others. And, you know, like, the lessons are often about the removal of personal biases and looking at things objectively, holistically, things like that. And like you were saying, you know, they all know that they're flawed and know that they have to work on shit about themselves. And that is like the scientific process that they're applying internally. You know, Troy goes through that kind of stuff like with people all the time. So yeah, it's like a progressive, like iterative process that everyone is supposed to go through.
And this isn't just a strict, like, scientific exploration of humanity. It's also an empathetic journey through what it's like for other people. Like, the main cast is always learning about other civilizations, other people, ostracized groups, people who have been on the fringes of whatever society that they have been a part of. And a big thrust of the series is acceptance of those differences in people and coming to respect and love people for what they are.
Yeah, there's lots of episodes that completely orbit around two alien races that have some kind of, you know, grief with each other, and both of them are completely legitimate from their own perspectives. Like, rarely do you have stuff like the Borg that are just like objectively, you know, terrible. Most often it's like, well, if I was in that circumstance, I'd probably be doing the same shit. So, fuck, let's talk this out, guys.
You don't need to have a PhD in planetary geology to play in or run a Star Trek episode. You don't need hard science, and you don't need Treknobabble. But, in my opinion, every Star Trek game needs study. You are studying something, and that could very well be human empathy. But you have to be analyzing and studying something. I cannot imagine a Star Trek game where you're not doing that.
And it's not just studying other things. You're also studying yourself as much as anything else.
So let's get into what it's like as a player character. I assume that we've all played at least a couple of Star Trek campaigns, right?
I have played one.
Okay.
Thank you, Kyle.
I've run a couple, played in a couple. The weird thing about playing in Starfleet that always comes up that I've seen is the same thing that happens anytime you're playing in a group that is within a setting-based hierarchical structure. And in a D&D group, everybody's like more or less equal. Maybe you got one leader. In Star Trek, if one person is playing a commander and another person is playing an ensign, there's not equality there, and it's on purpose. It's a meritocracy. You've got the oldest, most experienced people at the top, and then the young up-and-comers at the bottom. So that makes table play, where everyone is actually equal, or ideally equal, a lot to swallow for some folks.
It can be very challenging. It does not mean that you always have to follow orders. This maybe is obvious, but I'll say it. Look at the episode where there is either a lieutenant or a lieutenant commander, I think the latter, who wants to essentially murder and dissect Data. He wants to disassemble Data and study him. And he outranks, so this early in this series...
Yes, he does outrank.
So then he has to be a lieutenant commander, or perhaps even a full commander.
He has the authority of an admiral. Like, he is following an admiral's... Like, he was able to convince an admiral to go along with it.
That's correct, that's right. But regardless, this guy is not an ensign. And if you were running that as an episode or as a campaign, that guy, even with an admiral in his pocket giving him that authority, yes, he can order Data to report for disassembly, but the entire fun element of that episode is how subordinates are finding a way to prevail, and also showing that someone with that authority who has gone through the meritocracy of achieving that rank doesn't make them right. Nonetheless, you have to show that chain of command you can't have a game where you just ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
That episode is The Measure of a Man, and it's one of the episodes that I would recommend anyone who was watching The Next Generation watch.
One
It's a good
of my
one.
personal favorites.
And that's a season 2 episode.
But yeah, a lot of episodes are, Picard gets orders from some admiral that are stupid for some reason that the audience can see, but as a plot device, put the crew in a compromising situation, and then they have to work it out. Normally, in a role-playing game, that would be a pretty douchey move for a GM to pull on a group. That, well, you gotta do it because somebody says so. Well, fuck you. So you have to kind of get out of the mindset of, like, we're just freewheeling, murder hobos wandering around in a sandbox. Like, you're part of a much bigger thing, and you've worked your whole life to be there, and you're not going to flippantly, just fuck off and become a space pirate or something.
It's not to say you couldn't run a space pirate game in Trek. Totally viable.
Yeah.
But if you're going to run in any of the major empires, you got to have a chain of command.
I guess this is assuming that we're running a Starfleet game here. I mean, it would be the very similar set of problems if you were running a Romulan game or a Klingon game or something.
Even a fucking Ferengi game. You have worked your life to be in the Ferenginar.
Ferengal. That's fucking
The
gross.
Fungal. To be in the Navy of Ferenginar, you're going to follow the daemon. You're going to have a chain of command.
Mm-hmm.
Oh shit, fun anecdote though. If you're playing Klingons, you can fucking challenge your captain.
Yes.
That's
time.
cool.
Yeah, if you got a standard D&D group, maybe you do make them all play Klingons.
Huh.
That they're barbarians.
Remember that episode where there's a group of Klingons from before the Klingon Federation truce and partnership that had been on a long distance mission that were in hypersleep, coming back from that mission, and they had been in transit for like 30 years, and they're about to thaw, and they're going to be entering into a target-rich Federation-controlled zone, not knowing that they're now allies of the Federation.
I don't remember this episode. This is a next-gen episode?
Yeah, season 2. Another good one from season 2. Might have been early season 3, like literally
I'm pretty
first
sure it was
5
season 3,
episodes
but-
of season 3,
yeah.
but around there. It's where they introduce one of Worf's love interests.
And Alexander. Well,
nope,
is
nope,
mentioned,
but-
but it isn't.
Okay.
Maybe, but he's not in the episode.
Right.
And yeah, this awesome Federation operative who's half Klingon rolls in. They fucking rendezvous with an emptied out photon torpedo that she is lying in with a breathing mask that they rocketed out on an intercept course with the Enterprise. And she meets them, and their mission is to either destroy, which she's straight up all about, and the Federation's down with it too. And so's the Klingon Star Empire. Destroy that vessel. Or convince them that it's cool, we're chill now, we're buds. It's a good episode. And that would be a fun-ass campaign idea for people who just want to go be murder hobos.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all of the shows are about Starfleet, but there is enough information in the margins of all of the episodes that you could run a very fleshed out campaign that doesn't even touch being a member of the Federation. You could be a privateer. You could be a merchant. You could go from world to world, stealing, artifacts from alien worlds that are now extinct.
I've never run one, but I've always thought a Maquis game would be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For those who might not know, the Maquis are largely a group of former Federation defectors that were upset when the Federation signed a peace treaty with the Cardassian Empire, who had invaded a bunch of worlds, including one called Bajor, that they pretty much ran like a Nazi concentration camp, and the Maquis were pretty upset by the Federation calling off the war, I guess, and so they just started doing guerrilla warfare tactics and made an enemy of both sides.
And speaking of the Maquis, there's plenty of room for people in the fringes. I liked the way you phrased that, Clayton, I just forgot how you phrased it, the subtext of the show or something like that.
In the
margins. Yeah. Like, there's a lot of cool shit. You don't have to run a Federation crew.
There's all sorts of off-world colonists and settlers making their way to a new planet or settling on the planet and all the trials and tribulations that they've got to endure. Sometimes encountering stuff that's fucked up and they've got to call for Federation aid. But what in the hell happens before the Federation, one, gets the message and is able to get a ship there? There's all sorts of things that you could play around with just doing that, just being just someone on the fringes of inhabited space.
And in fact, if you want to be part of the Federation, but want a more loose chain of command, a Federation colony would have a leader. Mm-hmm. It would have sort of talented people loosely in charge of different areas of the colony's growth. But kind of beyond that, it would be a lot more of a free caucus. And if you want to do that, and then maybe a Federation ship shows up to give aid, and maybe that Federation captain's a real son of a bitch, you know? Like, the Federation could be a bit of an antagonist, but you could still run a Federation game.
And even if you're running in the Federation itself is a fucking huge bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And there's all sorts of people vying for their own self-interest, even though this is a future in which ideally everybody is working toward improving themselves and improving mankind. There are still going to be factions that disagree over what those ideals actually are. And you can run a lot of moral questions about the ethics of Star Trek while still maintaining the fact that both sides of the argument have very valid points and could be considered right, just depending on how the light shines.
Mm-hmm. I think that's something to consider even more heavily when running a Star Trek game, is that your antagonists, your villains, should absolutely have something compelling, and more than that, they should be right. It should be difficult not to see their side in most standard Star Trek games.
Yeah, give them a legitimate case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even the Borg, from like a really zoomed out perspective, you know, kind of have this idea that they're doing right by everything. Like, they're trying to make everything part of a collective, and they're taking care of everything as it absorbs stuff. They're not just going around massacring, they're trying to bring it all together, and it's this weird perversion of what the Federation is supposed to be.
Yeah,
that's what makes them compelling.
Yeah, they're not massacring, they're converting.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you join the Borg Collective, your consciousness will live on forever.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, going back to ideas that are, I guess we're still kind of there, alternative to just running a standard Federation crew and having to deal with the chain of command and all of that. It's a game I've always wanted to run. I've said this before. The entire party could be cadets at Starfleet Academy. In that regard, the party would not, one party member would not immediately have rank or authority over another. And in fact, you, the DM, could play around with changing up that authority. For one particular class project, one member of the party has been chosen to lead the group, and then that can completely change to another member for another mission that the cadets are sent on for some reason or another. You can play around with that, and then you, the DM, can have an NPC that is the admiral running the class or something like that.
There's a Deep Space Nine episode where, because of the Dominion War, they have to pull cadets into active service. They have a captain of their ship who is a Starfleet officer, but the ship is entirely crewed by cadets. Then when the captain gets killed, the cadets are there in hostile space, far behind enemy lines, and they've got to figure out what in the hell they're going to do. And the crux of that episode is how they don't have fully formed their ideas of the Federation and what the Federation stands for isn't as fully formed as somebody who was a full adult and has spent 20 years in the service.
And they're fucking 19-year-olds running a Miranda class.
It's almost Lord of the Flies. They're in a Defiant class ship,
Yeah.
aren't they?
Are they
Yeah,
really? I just assumed they
they're on
stuck them in a Miranda
gunship, man.
class. For the uninformed, the Miranda class is kind of the joke ship because anytime they need a ship that usually gets blown up or has something happen to it, it's a venerable old Miranda class. The Defiant class is a fucking hot shit, like, Corvette of the stars. Cool ship.
Yeah, it was the first and only Starfleet ship of the time to be built for war, and it is a fucking warship. It outguns any other ship in the fleet, and it's significantly smaller than any of the other ships that are usually sent into battle.
Hey, let's talk ships briefly. That's an important thing to have in a Star Trek game. Doesn't have to be a Federation vessel, but you're going to want to have a ship.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could have a colony game, but there should be a ship in orbit.
Well, that's one of the things I think is interesting with the Defiant and also with the Voyager and a few other kinds of ships that are out there. The Intrepid class, the Voyager. Some of these smaller, like more modern ships can go into atmosphere, land, do stuff like that. You know, it's more like a Star Wars kind of feel to how the ships work, whereas in the original series and a lot of the bigger ships in Next Gen, including the Galaxy class and whatever, are pretty well bound in orbit. If you get those things in atmosphere, it never works out well.
That was something that weirded me out about one of the JJ verse movies is that the Enterprise, an old school equivalent to a TOS Enterprise ship, just can go into orbit and go underwater.
Well, in J.J. Abrams' first Star Trek, the Enterprise was not being built in Space Dock. It was being built in Missouri.
Yeah. Right. Built on the planet. That's right.
The problem with J.J. Abrams is he doesn't know anything about Star Trek.
Yeah.
But we're getting nitty-gritty. The point is, the ship choice can be very important. If you want to have your crew, your players, go to a planet and not be without the backup of their ship, because you can take a shuttle down to any planet you want. But if you want them to be able to take their full ship down there, consider one of these smaller, more purpose-built for war or other reason, maybe a cargo ship of some sort that can go into atmosphere. Also, there are ships dedicated to scientific and medical endeavors in this universe, and they are lighter on the guns and the shields. There are ships that are, kind of run-of-the-mill, like explorers that have some combat capability. Those are pretty common, actually.
Excelsior.
Yeah. I've always really liked Star Trek ships, and there's a wealth. There are databases of ship ideas and ship designs. You can look at to choose what's right for your crew.
And you can play a campaign where your player characters are the senior officers in like leading a ship of 400 plus people, or you can have your player characters be the crew of a ship and there's nobody else around because the ship is that small.
Mm-hmm. This goes back a little bit to the chain of command thing, though. It's tricky to tell where within the chain of command your player characters should reside. Like, I think, generally speaking, it's probably a bad idea to have the captain be a player character at the table, because what they say goes. I think, at a glance, it would look like the command crew is the ideal slot for all your player characters to exist in, unless for some character reason they want to play an ensign or, lieutenant or whatever.
And briefly, command crew being the chief medical officer, the chief engineer, a senior level science officer, the head of security, stuff like that is what we mean.
Yeah. But then the problem that comes up is this is something that hilariously happens in original series all the time. When you have an away team going down, are you leaving the ship in control of all of the junior officers? Is everyone with decision making, except maybe the captain, staying on or going down to the planet? Sometimes it doesn't make sense. Like, why is all of our A team going at once? Like, do we need a security officer and the medical officer and the science officer and blah 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 all in one thing? I don't know. So there's not just questions about seniority and giving orders, but also questions about actual place in the game. You might play a science officer that doesn't leave the bridge.
Yeah.
And that can be very interesting, unlike in Dungeons and Dragons, where I will stay and guard the wagons. You know, the rest of you go have fun. Sure, you can have a raiding party show up. You could have some random friendly trader show up to interact with the character guarding the wagons. But they're pretty much stuck there, guarding the wagons. Star Trek, that science officer, air quotes, stuck on the bridge, they can do a whole hell of a lot if you give them the latitude. They can be simultaneously running a series of experiments that will help the players better do their job on the planet, while also monitoring the progress of those players, jumping in to transport them out or transport equipment down to them, jumping over to tactical to give them phaser fire or launch probes or load up some photon torpedoes with some kind of like tachyon beam array emitter shit, send that shit down there. Like, they're the eye and talons and brain in the sky, all from one room on one starship.
As a DM running Star Trek, you pretty much have to assume that your party is going to be split between the surface and the ship.
Yeah.
And that's cool. That's what some of the best episodes have, is, you know, this two-sided conflict that's going on.
Yeah, and that's one of the truly unique and amazing things about running a game in this universe. If you're stuck on the bridge, you're not stuck on the bridge. You've got a lot of cool shit you can do. You're not the driver. You're not the wagon guarder. Even the pilot of a ship in the Star Wars universe, as much as pilots are cool and the best of us, like, you fly the ship. Cool.
There's also, like we've touched on this in other episodes, that phenomenon of having a lot of NPCs under your command. It changes the agency that is typically afforded to a player in a role-playing game. That normally you're just yourself with your gear and your skills, but when you've got a whole department of people that you can split up, you know, this team go work on this, you do this thing, blah blah blah. The range of possibilities, like you were saying, at somebody's fingertips are much more than I think what a DM who's only ever run Dungeons and Dragons would be expecting out of the characters.
And you can really, as a player character, since you are in command of so many, potentially in command of so many different people, your command decisions are which systems are getting prioritized, what are the things that are important right now, and what are we going to take care of right now, and what needs to be put on the back burner. And so you're making those critical decisions of determining what resources are going to be available first, second, third. And resource management is something that is often not a part of role-playing games as much as the tactical part of swinging your sword.
And since all authority is going to come from the captain, at least on the ship, like I was saying, I think that it's a very touchy role to do anything with because there's so much power there. I don't think it should be in the hands of one player, and often people aren't going to like the DM being in control of the guy who's ultimately calling the shots. And I think the best balance is to have the captain's will, unless there's some narrative reason for it to be otherwise, just be whatever the consensus is among the player characters. It's just the de facto, orders.
And that's kind of Picard's bread and butter. He listens to and takes the opinions of his entire senior staff into consideration, and then makes a call. And you as a DM can make that call be the consensus of the majority of the group, if you want. If for plot reasons you want to or need to have your NPC captain issue a command from on high, Picard does that too. Not every episode, though. He doesn't abuse that power. Don't you do that either.
And the commands aren't like, okay, tactical, I need you to fire at... you see that nacelle over there on the other ship, the third one from the right, I want you to shoot that one. The Picard's just giving orders of, like, fire on the ship, fire on their nacelles. It's up to... later in the series, Worf standing there at the controls, determining where the shots are going to do, actually making the decision of how those orders are implemented. And that's what your player characters should be doing. They should be given a broad enough order that they can then use their own initiative to decide how that order is followed out.
I think it's also worth mentioning that if you want to play a Star Trek game within Starfleet that feels like the shows and movies and everything, people need to role play with that sort of etiquette and restraint and respect for each other that you see. It's one thing when, a fighter and a thief get into it and, well, fuck you and blah, 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 roughhouse like idiots. That is not how things work when you're working in Starfleet. Like, you are all highly trained professionals, and nobody's backsassing their commanding officer and, being assholes. You have to recognize that you're not just any wild ass character that you feel like making on a sheet. Like, you're a person in a civilization that has norms, and, you wouldn't have made it that far if you were an asshole.
Mm-hmm.
Well, an asshole who doesn't know how to fit within the mold of Starfleet. There are plenty of assholes, and you can be an asshole, but you know when to suck up to your commanding officer. You know when to follow orders without insubordination. You know when to be kind to and be an asshole to your subordinates. You do not have to play a, yes sir, no sir, boring shell of a character, but as Jordan was saying, yeah, you need to agree to the suspension of disbelief associated with playing a member of Starfleet. And you need to, in the public eye or in the eye of your superiors and peers, conduct yourself as such. But you're off in 10 forward, you've had a couple of synthahals, and you're hanging out with a fellow player who is from a different department. Bitch all you want about your PC executive officer, bitch all you want. But you don't do that on the bridge. You don't do that in the ready room.
Whenever we did a Beta, at the very beginning of that campaign, I laid it out that you guys were going to be playing a mercenary company. One of you was going to be in charge of the mercenary company and basically the commanding officer of everybody else.
Yeah.
What I did was I had you all vote out of character whose character is going to be the leader in this scenario. That way you've got the players buy-in that, okay, we are all agreeing that in this command structure, Jordan, your character is going to be the top of the command structure for us. Mm-hmm. That way, both in character and out of character, you have that agreement between the players that this is how things are going to be. Mm-hmm. And you were very good with respecting the other players or other characters, everything that they brought to you, but you still had final decision. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that is probably one of the best ways to handle the command structure that comes with something like Star Trek, is make sure that all the players have that baseline buy-in at the very beginning of the game as to who they're going to be listening to.
Mm-hmm. I think it could be a very interesting and rewarding experience to have an all-PC command structure, including a PC captain of the ship. But all of your players, like we did with Ibena, need to agree ahead of time to the command structure, and they all need to agree to buy in, to suspend their disbelief as a bunch of friends who are equals around the table, and buy into that command structure. And with the right group, I think there can be a lot of very, very rich roleplay experience from that.
It'll take a mature group of players.
Mm-hmm.
I would not try Star Trek as someone's first role-playing game, maybe not even their second or third role-playing game.
Mm-hmm. Unless you're a really big fan of Star Trek and happen to have never role-played, because then it'll come like second nature to you. But anyway, I agree with you.
Yeah, I wouldn't take a bunch of people who've only had experience playing 6 months of D&D and expect them to play Star Trek in any way that resembles what we know Star Trek to be.
Yeah. Unless that player had grown up on Star Trek like we had, and that was... They know the setting inside and out, and they know that no matter what the the lieutenant commander does not mouth off to the captain.
Right.
Ever.
Unless they don't want to be a lieutenant commander anymore.
So do we want to talk a little bit about the different time periods in which the campaign can be set? Because there's, like, in the real world, Star Trek has been coming out for 50 years. And in universe history of Star Trek, the series have spanned, 200 years now at this point?
Let's see.
With Picard coming out.
When does Enterprise happen in, like, the AD, Gregorian calendar?
Throw out a wild guess. 2180, but I have no idea. I'll look it up.
Something like that. Okay. And Next Gen is, like, 2370s or something?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I got 200 years or so.
So I was close. Jonathan Archer, that's the captain in Star Trek Enterprise. He's born in 2111, and a little before then, in 2103, Earth has just colonized Mars. Jump up to 2150, construction begins on the NX-01 Enterprise. And in 2161, the United Federation of Planets is founded by Earth, Andoria, Vulcan, and Tellar. That's the Tellarites. If we're looking at on-screen history, I guess in 2245, the Constitution-class USS Enterprise is launched. So, yeah. Here we go. Chris Pike, the captain in the Cage, the premiere of Trek, that's 2250. So I guess it on-screen begins in 2250. Well, no, wait, shit. I've completely lost track of what I was going for here, because Star Trek Enterprise takes place before then. Anyway, you get the idea. It's
about 200 years.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stories that happen within those 200 years, and there's a lot of gaps where you could set your adventures not necessarily at the same time as one of the series, but maybe a little bit before or a little bit after, and you still have a wealth of stories that you could play on.
Yeah, there's 2 whole generations of Enterprises between original series and Next Gen that we know virtually nothing about, but be in the sea.
Yep. So I've got the chronology of Trek, the eras, being the birth of the Federation, which is when Star Trek Enterprise is set. The original series and Discovery set kind of the same time, and then Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager all being set during the same time period. We're getting ready to have Star Trek Picard come out, and that'll be about 20 years after that era. And then there was an episode of Star Trek Enterprise where it was very, very briefly hinted at what the future was like with the Enterprise J, where the Federation was crumbling.
Yep.
I think that would be fucking awesome to play.
That was a wild episode. Talking about eras of Star Trek is really, really complicated, because in the real world, the legal agreements between Paramount and NBC are a clusterfuck, and
CBS.
Or CBS, I mean. And because of that, though intellectual property never exists in Star Trek unless Kirk is wanting to push around Harry Mudd, this has ramifications for the canon. So you've got the JJ verse. I don't know what the fuck the explanation is for Discovery, because it doesn't make sense with anything else in a bunch of different ways. It's before the Kelvin timeline split, but the technology's totally different. The Klingons are totally different. The Vulcans are totally different. It sticks out like a sore thumb, and I can't figure out any way to make it work aside from just an alternate universe version of Star Trek somehow. So I'd set that one aside completely if you care about continuity across the eras, and the same largely is true of the Kelvin timeline, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, don't forget the mirror universe.
Yeah.
Where the Terran Empire?
Terran Empire, yeah.
Terran Empire is an evil version of the Federation. God, Dominatrix Kira.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Anyway.
So you've not only got an entire quadrant of the galaxy, but you've also got 200 years of time in which to play things. And I really wouldn't worry too much about, like, how technology is changing over the course of Star Trek, just because of the issue of when the original series came out and the stuff that's coming out now, the technological discrepancy that we are able to portray, and the idea behind what is futuristic now versus what was futuristic in the 60s. I mean, because of Star Trek, we have had engineers and scientists who have been striving to invent the technology that we have seen in the series. And so I would say we are living in an alternate timeline. So do whatever you want and just make sure that transporters are a thing, phasers are a thing, replicators are a thing, and you're pretty much good to go.
Yeah, warp travel. Don't forget warp travel.
Yeah, warp travel.
Man, speaking of phasers, that's a whole ball of wax. That's a can of worms. Phasers are such a little, like, when appropriate, use appropriately multi-tool. They're not just a rifle. There are episodes where Geordi drops some iron ore into a trough made out of mud and uses his phaser to melt it into a climbing pick. Like,
let's go over what phasers can do. They've got a couple different settings. On the lower settings, they're just going to inflict a little bit of pain or maybe stun someone, maybe knock them unconscious. You get a little higher up, it's more like a laser. You can bore right through things, whatever. You get even higher up, and you're basically disintegrating whatever you hit. And then you've got various beam widths that can do each of those things in various, arcs in front of you. One episode, they're on a frozen planet, multiple episodes. They put a big rock right in the middle of them and heat it up to glowing hot with their phaser to substitute for a fireplace. So these are a few things they can do. You can bore a tunnel through solid rock to get somewhere.
Figure out the vapor point, the point at which a certain alloy will sublimate and hit it to create a smoke screen. That happens. Go down to pinpoint laser scalpel accuracy to excise a fucking tumor. Like, they're broad in their use.
And can be as narrow in function as you want.
Yep. If we're going to talk about the Kelvin timeline, phasers there are literally just two function. They're pistols. One side stuns, one side kills. That's it. And you know what? If you want to do that as a DM, it's fine. Got to simplify things somehow. It's a crazy broad universe, and if you don't want, you're boring. But if you don't want people, thinking
about how to solve problems creatively,
well, maybe don't play Star Trek. Okay, fine. But it could get a little out of hand because there's just so much a phaser can do, and so much a lot of different technology in the Star Trek universe can do.
Yeah, I mean, the data pads that they're using, we're not really shown what they're actually doing with them, so it could be everything that we're doing on our computers now, and more.
Let's talk about tricorders for a second. Holy shit. If there is probably one Star Trek thing I would want to have, like one device, it would be a tricorder. It wouldn't be a phaser. It would be a tricorder. So far as we know, stop me when I get ridiculous here, you can pretty much, over some period of time, get any measurable data from a region of space in front of you, wherever you happen to be, in the form of, quantified readouts, down to, atomic shit. Through solid rock, through whatever, get life form readings, get, chemical makeup of stuff, like, whatever the hell you want to know. Energy signatures of stuff that went down, like, sometime in the past, it's just kind of lingering about. It's an omnidetectional device.
There are definitely limitations to that. You don't see someone pulling out a tricorder on a ship and figuring out things about the Romulan ship that is 1,000 kilometers away. and you don't see someone using a standard flip-open tricorder to realize that what killed this person was not cardiac arrest, but a virus specifically designed to assassinate that person.
Then you need a medical tricorder.
That's a medical tricorder, exactly. So tricorders are not solve-alls, but they're figure-out-mosts.
Yep.
They are the clues that let you figure out the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they should be used in the game, is that they're the mechanism by which the player characters get clues.
For sure. It also eliminates a lot of otherwise, fairly boring, like, spot perception kinds of checks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me just run my tricorder, and here's your info dump of all the relevant things in this scene.
Do we have any other points? We're starting to get a little long.
Okay.
We haven't talked about combat, but maybe we don't need to. We've covered a lot of the elements of combat. I think it goes without saying that to do combat in Trek, you simply synthesize a lot of the previous topics we've talked about. Ethics, morality, sensing, phasers. I mean...
Well, I guess expectation of combat is something that we should probably mention, synthesize all of this. Because in D&D, you sit down and you expect, okay, here's the big boss monster. We're going to be whittling away at this guy for the next 45 minutes to an hour. Trek, it's more like everybody is most likely going to get killed within the first shot. So we should really talk this out. And if it gets down to shooting, it's going to be maybe a round, maybe 3 on the outset if you duck for cover. You're not going to be blasting away at each other for multiple rounds. I've never seen a Trek combat go more than probably 3 rounds.
It is far more critical to have someone roll about the history and design of the enemy ship so you can figure out how to get the drop on it than it is for the tactical officer to roll to hit with phasers. 10 to 1 more important to know your enemy and know your own capabilities.
Oh, yeah. If you can get the exact frequency of the enemy ship, you can tune your phasers to that frequency and shoot through it like it's not even there.
And that's what they're trying to do to you.
Yep.
So really, most combat is just a science off. Like on the ship level, it's just a science off between the two ships in order to...
And that could be a social science off. That could be straight up an engineering off. It doesn't have to be Treknobabble. It doesn't have to be, we've inverted the phase modulator to blobby blue blue blue. It literally could be, wait a minute, our anthropologist knows that enemy, they typically will only attack when they feel like they have no other alternative. So how can we figure out, like, to tell them, no, wait, there are other options. Like, that could be critical.
There's a lot of mind games and diplomacy that goes on before any of this. But when rubber meets the road and you're actually deploying all this technology at your fingertips, the closest analog to another role-playing game I could think of from a DM's perspective would be like trying to run D&D where the entire party is like 15th level wizards.
Yep. All right, let's go ahead and move on to geek things.
Okay.
We're getting a little long. So, have you guys seen or read about how researchers have been giving octopuses ecstasy to see how it affects their brains?
Oh,
No.
yeah.
They get social whenever they're given ecstasy. And the octopus is a solitary hunter, a solitary creature, and they get cuddly.
You start dancing, get real sweaty.
So that's, I might have already mentioned it on here as a previous geek thing, but since we're talking about Star Trek, there's a very great, there's many great Star Trek YouTube channels, but one of them that I like is called, it's by a guy named Steve Shives. He does a series called Trek Actually, where he talks about the minutia of Star Trek and its implications. And, it's a series I love. I can't wait for a new episode to come out. That's all my geek things.
I've got 2. I've got one geek suggestion and one geek warning, and for the same exact reasons. Since we're doing a Trek episode, I'm going to take the opportunity to shit on Star Wars. I saw Rise of Skywalker, and I didn't like a single thing about it. Take that for what you will, but if you've read any of the reviews, probably telling you the truth. So I'm deeply disappointed, and is abysmal. Bringing it up to a positive note, Season 4 of The Expanse is amazing. It's really, really good. It's well thought out, lots of character development, the conflicts are interesting, the science is pretty on point. It's well worth a look, so if you want to check that out, The Expanse, real great.
I yesterday played through about 3/4, it's a pretty short game, of Sayonara Wild Hearts, which is a like synthwave kind of pseudo vector graphic inspired, we'll call it a rhythm / bullet hell game. It's stylish as hell. The music is all written for the game, and it's very cool, kind of that like 80s inspired, like modern synthwave, retro wave kind of stuff. Very, very gorgeous, kind of minimalist graphics. If you're into like that aesthetic, plus games like Rez or like bullet hell shooters, arcade style bullet hell shooters, definitely check it out. Really, really, really stylish. And, it's a pretty short playthrough, but it's one of those games that I'll probably play through. All of my friends, if they're around and have an hour to 2 hours of free time, I'd like to watch them play through. And then I'll probably forget about it for about 2 years and then happily be like, oh shit, that game exists, and play through it again. It's not that expensive. It's, I don't remember the cost, but, it's cool. Check it out.
All right, guys. What do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Okay.
That sucked.
Yeah, that is the worst one we've done yet.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.